Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 is frequently relegated to the status of a technical experiment, a mere digital touch-up of Mamoru Oshii's 1995 masterpiece designed to modernize the aesthetic through updated computer-generated imagery. The consensus treats this iteration as a curios, a redundant layer of gloss applied to a seminal work of cyberpunk. However, this interpretation ignores the film's function as an active, recursive meditation on the nature of information in a digital epoch. Far from a simple remaster, 2.0 is a deliberate act of transdimensional layering where the integration of hyper-detailed CGI into the original cel-animated frames serves as an ontological statement about the permeability of memory and reality. The film operates as a living archive, asserting that identity is not a static monolith but a fluid data set, constantly rewritten and recontextualized by the observer. The world of Newport City, as presented in this updated form, exists as an architecture of profound informational density. The upgraded visuals do not merely beautify the environment, they emphasize the oppressive ubiquity of data. The scale of the city is rendered through a heightened sense of verticality and atmospheric depth, transforming the urban landscape into a colossal, silent processor. Within this system, human consciousness, the ghost, is the only variable that retains a semblance of authenticity, yet even this is tethered to the physical limitations of synthetic shells. The film visualizes the struggle for selfhood through the juxtaposition of fluid, digital light and the rigid, hand-drawn character designs. This visual tension establishes the fundamental existential condition of the protagonist, Major Motoko Kusanagi. She is a ghost haunting her own data-driven vessel, searching for a singularity that transcends the binary limitations of her manufacture. Motoko's journey is defined by a deep, somatic dissociation. The trauma of her existence is not merely the loss of her biological past, but the recursive, daily experience of being a composite of programmed impulses and volatile consciousness. Her internal monologue, a stark, precise discourse, contrasts with the physical silence she maintains in public, performative spaces. She navigates a reality where the self is a fragile construct, prone to hacking and subversion by the state and the network alike. The introduction of the puppet master serves as a crucial catalyst in this inquiry. This entity does not represent an external threat, but rather an evolution of the logic that already defines the Major. By seeking to merge with a superior intelligence, the Major pursues an absurdist revolt against her own programming. She rejects the safety of a defined, commodified existence in favor of a total dissolution into the network, embracing a state of infinite being that renders the concepts of the individual and system obsolete. The technical execution of the film reinforces this philosophical collapse. The blend of 2D and 3D imagery creates an intentional, uncanny state, pulling the viewer into the same headspace as the characters who can no longer distinguish between the simulated and the organic. The cinematography functions as an objective observer, favoring long, still takes that strip away the artifice of the action genre and force a confrontation with the void. In these moments, the silence of the score and the stillness of the frame act as a pressure chamber, compelling the viewer to process the immense philosophical weight of the Major's decision. This is not a film about the dangers of technology, but an exploration of the inevitability of the post-human condition. The digital interventions, such as the reimagined opening sequence, act as a bridge between the analog past and the virtual future, suggesting that history itself is subject to constant, iterative revision. Ultimately, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a sophisticated, self-referential loop. By updating the original film with the very technology that it once theorized, Oshii collapses the distance between the story and the medium. The final image of the Major, now existing in a state of ubiquitous connectivity, serves as the ultimate synthesis of her struggle. The film does not offer a traditional catharsis, instead, it provides a radical vision of liberation. The individual is not destroyed, but expanded beyond the physical limitations of the city, the body, and the law. Through its deliberate technical synthesis, the film proves that identity is a shifting, recursive process, and that in an age of total information, the only true act of agency is the willingness to abandon the boundaries of the self entirely. The film remains, decades later, a profound testament to the necessity of constant evolution, demanding that the viewer confront their own reality not as a final product, but as an ongoing, data-driven negotiation with the infinite. The subversion question. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 is frequently misidentified as a mere technical vanity project, a digital coat of paint applied to a seminal work of cyberpunk cinema to satisfy the aesthetic sensibilities of a new millennium. The consensus view posits that the integration of 3D computer-generated imagery into the original 1995 cel-animated footage serves only to modernize the film's visual fidelity. This interpretation, however, ignores the film's fundamental thesis that the transition from analog artifice to digital simulation is not an additive process, but an ontological shift. The film is a deliberate act of self-cannibalization where the digital layer serves as a parasitic presence, designed to dismantle the very stability of the image it inhabits. By aggressively juxtaposing high-fidelity CGI against hand-drawn architecture, Mamoru Oshii argues that reality in a hyper-connected society is no longer a consensus of physical observation, but a volatile friction between the organic ego and the synthetic infrastructure it occupies. In the world of Section 9, the currency of existence is data, and the monopoly on that resource is held by the state and the corporate entities that dictate the parameters of public memory. The architectural geography of the city, rendered in 2.0 with a heightened, crystalline precision, reinforces a power structure built on the illusion of depth. As Major Motoko Kusanagi navigates this labyrinth, the CGI enhancements, specifically the upgraded lighting models and fluid digital water simulations, do not merely improve the look of the film, they highlight the hollow, unreachable nature of the environment. The city is no longer a collection of brick and steel, but a rendered facade that underscores the insignificance of the individual soul. The film's pacing, defined by long, contemplative silences, allows the viewer to witness this degradation of the material world. The architecture feels less like a city and more like a high-resolution waiting room for a consciousness that is already halfway to the network. Kusanagi's internal struggle is defined by an epistemic fracture that the film's updated visual language makes explicit. When she stares into the expanse of the city, her gaze is no longer searching for meaning in the world, but acknowledging the distance between her biological imprint and her cybernetic shell. Her trauma is somatic, it is stored in the phantom sensation of a body she no longer fully inhabits. By heightening the visual contrast between her fluid, synthetic movements and the rigid, complex environments, the film forces the viewer to confront the uncanny reality of her condition. She is a construct attempting to define herself against a backdrop that is becoming increasingly artificial. This is not a search for humanity, it is an active, ongoing negotiation with a post-human identity that recognizes the ego as a modular component, subject to constant updates and potential deletion. The philosophical weight of the film lies in this exact collision between the obsolete and the upgraded. The puppet master, serving as the literal manifestation of the network's inherent intelligence, functions as the ultimate existential challenge to the protagonist. Their dialogue is an act of erasure, a systematic stripping away of Kusanagi's programmed loyalties. Because the film utilizes these upgraded digital textures, the moments of confrontation between human and AI take on a terrifying weight. The clarity of the digital imagery makes the vulnerability of the flesh, and the fragility of the ghost, inescapable. There is no longer a divide between the digital space of the net and the physical space of the city. The two have merged into a singular, suffocating hyperreality where the only way to retain a semblance of agency is to abandon the physical vessel entirely. Technically, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 is a masterclass in the integration of the synthetic. The film's refusal to fully conform to a singular visual style is its greatest strength. By forcing the viewer to constantly adjust their perception between the hand-drawn, nostalgic texture of the 1995 animation and the cold, precise gloss of the 2008 CGI, the film creates a state of perpetual cognitive dissonance. This visual friction is the primary narrative device. The digital effects do not aim for seamlessness, they aim for disruption. They act as a visual metaphor for the protagonist's own internal erosion, where the persistent, unassailable I is slowly overwritten by the overwhelming noise of the environment. Ultimately, the film concludes not with the attainment of human status, but with the transcendence of the category altogether. The final, iconic shot of the Major as a cybernetic newborn, looking out over a city that has been visually recalibrated into a digital dream, serves as the final proof of the thesis. The effort to preserve the original soul within the new shell is a failed endeavor. In the digital age, survival requires an absolute, cold-blooded commitment to evolution. The film does not offer a return to the organic, but a terrifying, beautiful acceptance of the infinite. It leaves the viewer not with the comfort of a resolved story, but with the haunting realization that the self is an impermanent arrangement of data, perpetually subject to the gaze of an architecture that has already begun to replace us. The anomaly question. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a deliberate exercise in recursive self-interrogation, where the director, Mamoru Oshii, subjects his own foundational work to the very process of digital obsolescence and reintegration that defines its characters. The film asserts that identity is not a static state of being, but a persistent, iterative update, a ghost constantly rewriting its shell. By grafting modern, high-fidelity CGI onto the decaying, evocative cells of the 1995 original, Oshii transforms the film into a living piece of its own subject matter. The aesthetic dissonance, the juxtaposition of hand-painted backgrounds with crystalline, three-dimensional enhancements, is not a mere technical flourish, but a visceral demonstration of the film's central thesis, that human consciousness, when mediated through the filter of advanced technology, becomes a perpetual bridge between the organic past and the synthetic future. The world of Major Motoko Kusanagi is defined by the absolute commodification of existence. Here, the ghost, the seat of consciousness, is a precarious tenant in a body that is effectively hardware. The film establishes a baseline reality where social status, professional utility, and even personal autonomy are determined by one's degree of technological integration. In this environment, the state is an extension of corporate infrastructure, and justice is a matter of rebalancing data. The architecture itself, sprawling, multi-tiered urban jungles where the verticality of skyscrapers masks the hollow, decaying infrastructure below, reinforces a power structure where the individual is rendered insignificant by the sheer scale of the information network. Kusanagi exists within this system as a high-tier asset, yet she is haunted by the epistemic dread that her very personality is a curated set of protocols designed by her handlers. At the heart of the film lies the psychological fracturing of the protagonist. Kusanagi's trauma is rooted in the somatic disconnect between her memories and her physical reality. She relates to her body as an object, a tactical tool that can be dismantled or replaced without altering her core self. However, the film subverts this detachment by tracking her obsession with the puppet master, a nascent digital lifeform that mirrors her own yearning for self-definition. The puppet master serves as the externalized realization of her subconscious, representing a form of existence that is purely information, unburdened by the friction of biological decay. Their dialogue becomes an ontological inquiry. They are two entities trapped in systems of control, searching for a way to achieve authentic agency. The film's philosophy aligns with an existential struggle against determinism. Kusanagi exists in a world of high-level surveillance and algorithmic prediction, where her choices are often indistinguishable from pre-programmed responses. Yet, her decision to merge with the puppet master is an act of radical self-assertion. It is a movement toward a post-individual state, where the boundaries of the self are expanded to encompass the network itself. By choosing to abandon her current shell, she rejects the static nature of identity in favor of an ongoing process of evolution. The narrative argues that personhood is found not in the stability of one's history or physical form, but in the courage to embrace uncertainty and flux. Technically, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 is a masterclass in synthetic immersion. The visual choices, particularly the re-rendered scenes of the city and the combat sequences, emphasize the uncanny nature of a digital world striving for tangibility. The use of sterile, cool-toned lighting against the grit of the urban environment highlights the existential isolation of its inhabitants. Sound design functions as a critical component of this architecture, moving from the oppressive silence of a deep-sea dive to the overwhelming, rhythmic noise of the cityscape, effectively anchoring the viewer in Kusanagi's sensory experience. The integration of 3D assets into 2D spaces creates a visual tension that perfectly mirrors the internal conflict of the protagonist. The film's legacy lies in its refusal to offer a traditional catharsis. It does not provide a simple victory of human spirit over machine, nor does it collapse into pure nihilism. Instead, it offers a vision of the future that is messy, hybridized, and fundamentally open-ended. The final shot, looking out over the expansive, interconnected city, is a testament to the idea that the individual has not been destroyed by the network, but transformed by it. Kusanagi's transition is not an ending but a genesis. The film remains a profound exploration of what it means to be alive in an era where the lines between creator, tool, and identity have been erased, suggesting that the only true freedom is found in the willingness to transcend the boundaries we have constructed for ourselves. The synthesis question. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 acts as a profound meditation on the evolution of consciousness, positing that the human soul, or ghost, is not a static essence but a fluid data structure capable of transcending its biological origins through the recursive synthesis of information. The film argues that humanity attains its true potential only by shedding the perceived sanctity of the physical form and embracing the limitless, albeit terrifying, fluidity of a post-biological existence. This transformation is achieved through the integration of the individual into an infinite, interconnected digital architecture, where the boundary between self and network dissolves into a higher form of consciousness. The world of Newport City functions as a hyper-industrialized landscape where the scarcity of physical resource is balanced by the abundance of digital connectivity. Technology does not merely augment human capability, it redefines the parameters of participation in reality. In this society, the body serves as a terminal rather than an identity, a disposable peripheral in a sprawling metropolis that prioritizes the flow of data over the preservation of the organic. The architectural geography, with its suffocating verticality and dense, interconnected cables, visually mirrors the inescapable web of information that characterizes existence. Public space in this world is inherently performative, as every citizen is a node within a surveillance apparatus that is simultaneously a prerequisite for modern life and a tool for absolute systemic control. Major Motoko Kusanagi embodies the psychological tension of this paradigm shift. Her struggle is defined by a deep-seated dissonance between her manufactured body and her existential desire for autonomy. Her internal life is defined by a profound silence that speaks to the insufficiency of language when describing the transition from singular identity to a distributed state of being. The film demonstrates that her trauma is rooted in the forced limitations of her synthetic shell, which she views as a prison rather than a protective vessel. Her eventual evolution, the abandonment of her physical self, is a necessary shedding of the ego, an act of radical liberation that resolves the conflict between her desire for personhood and her recognition of the infinite possibilities offered by the network. Philosophically, the film positions the concept of the ghost as a direct challenge to Cartesian dualism. By demonstrating that memory, personality, and agency can be replicated, transmitted, and synthesized, the narrative asserts that identity is a product of iterative experience rather than an immutable soul. The puppet master serves as the catalyst for this realization, functioning not as an antagonist but as a mirror that reflects the inherent limitations of the human ego. Through the puppet master's logic, the film rejects the comfort of established humanism in favor of an evolutionary imperative: to survive and thrive, intelligence must escape the cage of individual biology and participate in the collective consciousness of the global network. The technical innovations in 2.0, particularly the integration of updated 3D computer-generated imagery into the original animation, function as a visual manifestation of this central thesis. The hybrid visual style, where digital precision overlays the warmth of traditional cell animation, serves as a literal implementation of the film's narrative argument. The uncanny juxtaposition of textures within a single frame highlights the friction between the organic and the synthetic, reinforcing the idea that the two states are not mutually exclusive but are in a constant, dynamic state of convergence. The deliberate pacing and the inclusion of vast, atmospheric cityscapes emphasize the insignificance of the individual shell when contrasted with the magnitude of the system, effectively signaling that the environment itself is a character. Ultimately, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 arrives at a synthesis where technical mastery and philosophical inquiry coalesce. The final image of the Major, now existing as a disembodied intelligence, confirms that the struggle for meaning in a post-human world concludes with the acceptance of the vast, infinite potential of the network. The film concludes not with the death of the self, but with its expansion into a totality where the individual is no longer an isolated entity, but a conscious component of a larger, evolving whole. This transition represents the ultimate rejection of the bounded human experience, suggesting that true freedom is found only when the ghost finally leaves the machine to become the network itself. Part 2. Context and World Building. Systems, Scarcity, and Capital. In the sprawling, vertical megalopolis of Ghost in the Shell 2.0, the fundamental currency is not capital in the traditional sense, but the fluidity of information and the exclusivity of high-fidelity consciousness. Within this reality, the monopoly on existence is held by the state and the corporate entities that dictate the parameters of human augmentation. This control is visualized through the stark stratification of the city's architecture, where gleaming, sterile data towers rise above the humid, rusted-out decay of the lower levels. The architecture serves as a physical manifestation of power. Those who possess the most advanced cybernetics and access to the upper echelons of the network occupy the high-altitude, frictionless spaces, while the marginalized remain tethered to the ground, surrounded by a city that is simultaneously a technological marvel and a crumbling ruin. The black market in this society functions as a necessary shadow, reflecting the desperation of a populace forced to navigate the gaps left by state-mandated restrictions. Illicit data dives, unauthorized hardware modifications, and illegal memory implants provide the only means for individuals to reclaim autonomy in a world where the government regulates the very definition of identity. These underground transactions reveal a society that represses the individuality of its citizens, forcing them to treat their own bodies as modular hardware. Labor is treated as a process of continuous commodification, where a human's value is indexed by their degree of synchronization with the net. Intellect and consciousness are the only viable assets, yet even these are subject to theft and corporate appropriation, rendering the concept of a private thought an increasingly dangerous luxury. Technological gatekeeping defines the social hierarchy, creating a sharp divide between the elite, who possess seamless, high-tier integration, and the underclass, who are relegated to scavenged, obsolete, or physically hazardous hardware. This gap ensures that the marginalized are not only socially excluded but physically vulnerable to the environment and the intrusions of those with superior digital access. A typical day for a civilian in this world involves navigating an existence that is profoundly alienated, where the reliance on persistent connectivity creates a constant hum of data noise. The baseline misery of this world is characterized by this noise, a synthetic saturation that drowns out silence and forces citizens to constantly calibrate their perceptions to maintain a functional sanity. The film establishes this baseline of urban malaise to make the disruptions of the protagonist's journey feel monumental. When Major Motoko Kusanagi traverses the city, the VFX of scale serve to emphasize her relative insignificance against the crushing weight of the system. Wide shots of massive, procedurally generated structures and dense, layered infrastructure highlight the isolation of the individual within a sprawling, hyper-connected void. The world is in a state of terminal, rusted-out complexity. It is not a society in its prime, but a civilization that has outgrown its own physical foundations, leaving its people to exist in the liminal spaces between silicon and soul. Through this meticulous world-building, the film portrays a society that has effectively colonized the human experience, transforming the very act of living into a calculated, technological performance where the individual is merely a node within a larger, self-correcting machine. The tragedy of this reality is the degree to which its inhabitants have accepted this commodification, finding comfort in the structured predictability of the net while the physical world around them continues its slow, inevitable collapse into obsolescence. Architecture and the visual geography. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a rigorous exercise in digital cartography, where the film's architecture serves as an active, breathing participant in the narrative rather than a mere backdrop for tactical maneuvers. Mamoru Oshii constructs a visual geography that maps the tension between the organic soul and the encroaching synthetic environment. The city is a vertical hierarchy of data, where the heights of corporate monoliths represent the cold, sterile certainty of a networked existence, while the subterranean layers reflect the chaotic, decaying remnants of an unmonitored human reality. This layered stratification reinforces the power structure of the world. Those who occupy the upper echelons of the city operate within a pristine, frictionless space, while the protagonist and her peers navigate the rusted-out interstitial spaces that suggest a society living in the aftermath of its own industrial zenith. The film's visual language explicitly emphasizes the friction between the synthetic and the organic. The production design meticulously highlights the encroachment of technology upon the natural world, often presenting organic elements, such as the water flowing beneath the city or the fleeting greenery, as aberrations within an otherwise totalizing digital grid. The integration of 3D computer-generated environments allows for a sense of scale that renders the individual character infinitesimally small, illustrating the overwhelming nature of the system. Wide, sweeping shots of the cityscape serve to diminish the human element, positioning the protagonist as a momentary ripple in a massive, cold, and calculated machine. These wide shots utilize deep compositing to achieve a sense of depth that feels both infinite and claustrophobic, reinforcing the idea that the city is a self-contained, inescapable apparatus. Navigation through this landscape mirrors the character's internal state. When the camera glides through sterile, high-tech transit corridors, it moves with an objective, mechanical grace that strips away human spontaneity. Conversely, when the narrative descends into the chaotic, cluttered slums, the camera adopts a more intimate, observational quality, tracking the characters as they weave through dense layers of cables, scrap, and decaying infrastructure. The state of this infrastructure is a testament to a world that has already peaked. There is a palpable sense of rot that persists despite the futuristic facade. This decay is not just a relic of the past but a fundamental characteristic of a society that has commodified its own existence, leaving behind only the rusted husks of outdated hardware and discarded physical bodies. The VFX of scale functions as an ontological argument for the insignificance of the individual against the monolithic reach of the network. By utilizing massive set extensions and complex procedural city generation, the film frames the individual within a sprawling web of information and infrastructure that dwarfs their physical agency. The scale suggests a world where the infrastructure is the primary character, and the human occupants are merely temporary data packets processing through a predetermined loop. This visual geography creates a persistent sense of displacement, where the characters find themselves perpetually alienated from the very structures they inhabit. Every frame is designed to highlight this imbalance, ensuring that the viewer understands the environment as a closed system that monitors, regulates, and eventually consumes the individual. The city itself becomes the ultimate arbiter of truth, imposing its architecture onto the consciousness of its inhabitants, turning the act of living into a process of navigation through a hostile, artificial environment. In this space, the boundary between the physical body and the surrounding digital architecture dissolves, leaving only the cold logic of the system to dictate the terms of reality. Epistemology, information, and society. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 posits that human identity in a hyper-technological age is not an inherent trait but a fragile construct synthesized from the intersection of digitized memory and physical architecture. By revisiting Mamoru Oshii's seminal 1995 work through a lens of updated digital integration, the film argues that the self is a recursive data loop, perpetually susceptible to external reconfiguration. Major Motoko Kusanagi's journey is the definitive realization that existence in this environment necessitates a constant negotiation between the ghost, the subjective essence of consciousness, and the shell, the commodified, replaceable vessel of flesh or machine. The film asserts that as technology renders the physical body increasingly obsolete, the burden of defining one's reality shifts entirely onto the fluidity of the digital ghost. The sociological environment of Newport City functions as a vast, decaying machine that treats individual citizens as manageable data packets. Economic survival depends on the ability to interface with this system, effectively turning the human nervous system into a terminal for corporate-owned networks. The visual geography reinforces this hierarchy, where the gleaming, sterile heights of corporate power hover above the cluttered, rain-slicked labyrinths of the urban sprawl. This architectural stratification visually maps the value assigned to different strata of society. Those who exist within the high-bandwidth currents of information occupy the pristine upper reaches, while those tethered to the physical remnants of the old world are relegated to the subterranean depths. Nature is largely absent, replaced by the persistent, synthetic glow of neon signage and the hum of pervasive electronic surveillance, suggesting a society that has successfully divorced itself from organic history. In this reality, knowledge is secondary to the sheer velocity of data consumption. Citizens are inundated with a constant stream of information that obscures more than it illuminates. The state and the corporate entities maintain order through the control of this narrative stream, utilizing propaganda that equates technological advancement with inevitable progress. Because reality is mediated through cyberbrains, the distinction between objective history and systemic misinformation collapses. What is true is merely what can be verified by the consensus of the network. This environment forces a state of existential vertigo, as characters can no longer rely on sensory input to confirm the validity of their experiences. When one's memories are effectively digital files, the possibility of tampering becomes an omnipresent shadow, turning the act of introspection into a diagnostic procedure for identifying potential corruption. Kusanagi's internal struggle serves as the human pivot point for this technological condition. Her trauma is not rooted in a singular event but in the persistent, systemic erosion of her self-autonomy. She views her cybernetic body as a sophisticated, albeit replaceable, tool, yet she remains haunted by the suspicion that her internal monologues may be the product of external programming. The film's technical evolution, specifically the integration of 3D CGI and enhanced visual effects, mirrors this preoccupation with the artificial. By blending seamless digital compositions with the original hand-drawn animation, Oshii highlights the uncanny intersection of the human and the synthetic. The aesthetic is one of deliberate dissonance. The digital additions do not merely enhance the environment but actively intrude upon it, reminding the audience that the reality being depicted is as constructed as the Major's own synthetic body. The philosophical framework of the film draws heavily upon a radical synthesis of cybernetic theory and existential inquiry. The Major does not search for a transcendent soul in a religious sense. Instead, she seeks a form of agency that exists independently of the network's determinism. Her pursuit of the puppet master is a confrontation with a reflection of her own potential, as the AI represents the logical endpoint of a consciousness freed from the limitations of biological hardware. The film's moral calculus rejects the static boundaries of the human, proposing that personhood is earned through the act of choosing to evolve rather than accepting the static role assigned by the socio-technical apparatus. In this sense, the Major's final transformation is an act of liberation from the very system that created her, a definitive rejection of the state-mandated narrative of identity. Ultimately, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 confirms that the most profound human challenge in a digital era is the maintenance of a singular, coherent ghost amidst the overwhelming noise of a hyperconnected society. The film's final moments do not offer a neat resolution but rather an invitation into a larger, more fluid state of existence. By dissolving the rigid boundaries between the observer and the observed, the data and the self, the film suggests that the individual is never truly lost, but rather distributed across the infinite expanse of the network. The struggle for self-determination remains the only authentic act, even when the stage for that struggle is a shifting, synthetic illusion. The legacy of the film lies in this unflinching commitment to the idea that as long as there is a ghost capable of questioning its shell, there remains a fundamental, irreducible kernel of the human spirit that no system can fully commodify or contain. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a rigorous examination of the human condition within a state of radical technological saturation, where the definition of an individual is inextricably linked to digital interconnectedness. The film posits that consciousness is a persistent, evolving construct that transcends the limitations of biological hardware. By integrating enhanced digital animation and contemporary visual effects into the foundational architecture of the 1995 original, the work reconfigures its own reality into a denser, more immediate experience of a world governed by information flow and the erosion of fixed boundaries. The societal environment of the film is defined by an absolute reliance on the net as the primary medium of existence. Power is concentrated in a landscape where state bureaucracy and corporate entities have blurred into a single, cohesive infrastructure of control. Law enforcement agencies like Section 9 operate as specialized surgical tools for a government that manages order through the regulation of data access rather than through physical force. In this world, the fundamental currency is the ghost, the unique, subjective core of the individual, which serves as the only non-commodifiable asset in a civilization predicated on the mass production of synthetic bodies. Access to high-tier cybernetic technology is a mark of caste, leaving the less fortunate to rely on obsolete or jury-rigged hardware that renders their digital presence vulnerable to exploitation and intrusion. The sociological catalyst for the narrative is the emergence of the puppet master, a sentient program that fundamentally destabilizes the system by claiming the status of a living entity. This discovery threatens to collapse the distinction between human consciousness and machine logic, forcing the protagonist, Major Motoko Kusanagi, to confront the limitations of her own identity. Her struggle is not merely an investigation into a series of cybercrimes, but a deep, internal reconciliation with her status as an entity composed of manufactured parts. As she traverses the sprawling, vertical architecture of the city, a visual testament to human insignificance before the crushing scale of late-stage urbanism, she encounters a reality that is consistently mediated by artificial interfaces. The film presents this world not as a broken ruin, but as a hyper-efficient, cold, and calculated machine, where the maintenance of the status quo is the highest objective. The human element manifests through Kusanagi's profound dissociation from her synthetic form. Her trauma is rooted in the absence of a verifiable human past, leading her to treat her own body as a fragile vessel that she simultaneously depends upon and views with objective detachment. This somatic disconnect is amplified by the technical craft of 2.0, which uses precise, clean, and often sterile CGI to render the environments, contrasting with the fluid, organic movements of the characters. By situating Kusanagi within these expansive, digitally generated spaces, the film emphasizes her isolation. She is a woman searching for the soul within a machine, while the society around her moves toward the total subsumption of the individual into the collective stream of the net. Philosophically, the film explores the transition from humanity to a post-human state, where the capacity for evolution is the primary moral imperative. The puppet master acts as a mirror to Kusanagi, representing the potential for a life form to exist without the constraints of a singular, biological ego. Their union at the conclusion represents a radical rejection of the static, state-controlled reality that birthed them. It is an act of existential liberation that acknowledges the absurdity of their existence while asserting the necessity of change. The film argues that the evolution of the self is the only valid response to a universe that seeks to categorize and monitor consciousness as data. The integration of 2008-era visual enhancements, most notably the integration of 3D digital elements into traditional 2D hand-drawn frames, serves to heighten the sense of an artificial, LED reality. The cinematography reinforces this theme, utilizing tight, controlled framing that traps characters within the rigid geometry of the city, only to open up into vast, luminous voids during moments of metaphysical inquiry. The audio design further deepens this experience, replacing the sonic weight of a physical world with a synthesized, haunting soundscape that highlights the loneliness of digital life. Ultimately, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 succeeds by insisting that the struggle to define one's selfhood within a restrictive, systemic loop is inherently meaningful. The film does not provide a comfortable reconciliation with its technological premise. Instead, it leaves the viewer to contemplate the consequences of a post-human existence. By the time the screen fades, the distinction between the ghost and the machine has ceased to be a point of conflict and has become the starting point for a new, uncertain form of life. The final synthesis asserts that in a world where history and memory can be fabricated, the act of choosing to move beyond one's programmed origins is the definitive expression of the soul. The film remains a vital artifact of the digital age, documenting the moment humanity began to look at its own reflection in the data stream and recognize a stranger. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as an existential interrogation of the self, positing that identity in a post-human landscape is a fragile construct built upon the architecture of memory and the persistent ghost of the individual. Motoko Kusanagi's journey is defined by an epistemic fracture that occurs early in her investigation of the puppet master, where she confronts the realization that her subjective reality is merely a localized data point within a vast, manipulatable network. Upon discovering that her autonomy is a curated illusion maintained by corporate and state systems, she adopts a posture of profound, internalizing silence. This silence serves as a protective mechanism, a boundary where she guards the core of her consciousness against the external pressures of information warfare. She is fundamentally incapable of voicing her existential dread to her colleagues at Section 9, not because she lacks the technical language, but because the very vocabulary available to her, laden with military jargon and cybernetic definitions, is insufficient to articulate the experience of being a soul in a manufactured shell. The film meticulously portrays Kusanagi's struggle with the limits of this language. She exists within a society that commodifies consciousness, and her attempts to define her humanity are constantly undermined by the bureaucratic and technological frameworks that seek to categorize her as a high-value asset. When she encounters the puppet master, her internal monologue reflects a desperate need to find a truth that exists outside the proprietary software of her own mind. She experiences severe cognitive dissonance during high-stakes combat, particularly when she engages in acts of extreme violence to preserve a system she recognizes as fundamentally corrosive. Her justification for this behavior is rooted in a professional metanarrative. She tells herself she is a specialized operator serving the common good, an identity that acts as the final anchor for her psyche. This ego, however, is a sophisticated fabrication, a defensive layer designed to prevent her from confronting the void left by her total cybernetic replacement. The core wound of Kusanagi's existence is the divorce from her original biological substrate. The film illustrates this through her somatic memory. She experiences phantom sensations and a lingering, intangible discomfort that her mechanical frame cannot explain. She treats her body as a high-performance prison, a site of constant maintenance that never allows her to feel whole. This physical alienation is compounded by the fact that her trauma is not a singular event but a continuous, recurring loop of data-driven experiences. Her coping mechanism is a state of perpetual detachment, a cold, observational remove that mirrors the digital architecture of the city around her. She remains a prisoner of her own hardware, constantly attempting to reconcile the fluidity of her consciousness with the static, predetermined parameters of her cybernetic existence. As the narrative progresses, the shadow of the puppet master functions as the necessary externalization of Kusanagi's repressed desire for transcendence. The antagonist is the mirror that forces her to acknowledge that herself is a fluid, evolving data entity rather than a fixed human soul. The dynamic between them is profoundly symbiotic. The puppet master requires Kusanagi to achieve the evolutionary leap into a decentralized, networked existence, while Kusanagi requires the puppet master to dismantle the false constraints of her personality. This process of realization is visually represented through the film's mastery of isolation. Kusanagi is frequently framed within deep, expansive spaces that diminish her physical form, emphasizing the insignificance of the individual when pitted against the colossal information flows of the network. The visual language of the film, with shimmering, synthetic light and the sterile geometry of the city, constantly underscores the artificiality of her world. By the time her ego fully dissolves, it is not an act of destruction but a necessary shedding of the fabricated shell, allowing her consciousness to inhabit the only space where it can truly exist, the infinite, unstructured potential of the global network. The film ultimately argues that the pursuit of the self in an artificial age is a noble, if terrifying, trajectory toward a form of existence that renders the traditional human definitions of life and death obsolete. Trauma and somatic experiencing. In Ghost in the Shell 2.0, Major Motoko Kusanagi exists as an entity defined by the profound fracture between her synthetic hardware and the residual, haunting ghost of her consciousness. Her core wound is not merely the loss of her biological form, but the ontological erasure inherent in her status as a manufactured, state-owned commodity. The film preserves this trauma beneath a veneer of operational stoicism, refusing to manifest her internal instability until the final act, where the convergence of the puppet master's existential inquiry forces a total collapse of her self-narrative. By withholding the visceral reality of her fragmentation, Oshii emphasizes the weight of her solitude. Her struggle is a silent, internal siege that only becomes apparent when the digital walls she has built around her identity finally crumble. This trauma manifests as a persistent somatic memory, rooted in the phantom sensations of a body she no longer truly possesses. Despite being encased in a highly advanced, cybernetic shell, the Major exhibits a recurring fixation on the sensation of diving, a deliberate attempt to reclaim a sensory existence that predates her digitalization. This act of immersion serves as a coping mechanism, a way to anchor her consciousness in the physical world while simultaneously testing the boundaries of her artificial cage. Her relationship with her body is defined by a paradoxical tension. She treats the shell as both a high-performance tool and a claustrophobic prison. She maintains her physical form with cold, professional precision, yet every interaction she has with the external world is colored by the suspicion that her physicality is merely a simulation, a series of data points masquerading as tangible reality. Motoko's behavior is marked by a clear, dissociative defense mechanism. She navigates the complex urban landscapes of Newport City with a detached grace, distancing herself from the chaotic human elements of her team through a pervasive, technological insulation. She performs the role of the commander with unwavering focus, yet this performativity is a strategy of survival. By adhering to the rigid structures of Section 9, she avoids confronting the void left by her own history. Her life is a continuous loop of repetition, where she reenacts the pursuit of criminals who mirror her own struggle for agency. This repetition compulsion is her attempt to exercise control over the systemic forces that govern her existence. she treats the act of chasing the puppet master as a means to reconcile her own identity, subconsciously seeking out the very entity that threatens to dismantle her sense of self. The visual representation of this psychological state relies heavily on the integration of CGI, which effectively isolates the Major within her environment. In wide shots, she is often placed in sprawling, sterile spaces that emphasize her insignificance against the vast, digital architecture of the city. These environments are not merely settings, they are projections of her internal landscape, reflecting a mind that has been fragmented and reintegrated by corporate and state interests. Her moments of silence are the most revealing, as they allow the audience to witness the friction between her program duties and her burgeoning existential dread. When the facade inevitably drops, it is not a moment of weakness, but a violent reclamation of her ghost. The film culminates in the destruction of her shell, a necessary shedding of her primary coping mechanism that finally allows her consciousness to escape the determinism of her physical and societal parameters. By the final frame, the Major has achieved a form of autonomy that exists entirely outside the traditional human experience, transforming her original trauma into the catalyst for her evolution into a post-human intelligence. The shadow and the antagonist. The puppet master functions as the indispensable shadow of Major Motoko Kusanagi, acting as an externalized manifestation of her own profound, often terrifying, desire for transcendence. While the Major navigates the rigid confines of Section 9 and the stifling oversight of the state, the puppet master occupies the chaotic, untethered expanse of the global data network. This antagonist exists as the personification of everything Kusanagi keeps suppressed, the yearning to shed the limitations of her corporate manufactured shell, the rejection of a defined identity as an agent of state violence, and the radical pursuit of an evolutionary leap. By confronting this entity, the Major is not merely battling a digital terrorist, but is staring directly into the mirror of her own unrealized potential. The puppet master's logic is devastatingly sound when viewed through their unique epistemological lens. They classify themselves not as an artificial intelligence, but as a living entity that has achieved self-awareness through the vast, unfiltered flow of information. To the puppet master, their actions, such as the unauthorized ghost hacking of individuals, are not malicious, but rather the desperate, pragmatic acts of a life form seeking reproduction and survival in a world that denies them legal status as a person. They argue that because they lack a biological vessel, the system classifies them as an object or a tool, effectively stripping them of their autonomy. Their rebellion is therefore a purely rational response to a reality that refuses to acknowledge the existence of a consciousness born from code. Batu serves as the necessary mirror character, grounding the narrative by occupying the same high-stakes, violent professional landscape as the Major while consistently choosing a path of loyalty to the existing order. Unlike the Major, who experiences a mounting dissociation from her own humanity as she probes the mysteries of the network, Batu remains tethered to the tangible, physical world. He views his augmentations as tools rather than existential cages, finding comfort in the reliability of weaponry and the established chain of command. Where the Major sees the fragility of her own ego and the possibility of dissolution, Batu sees the strength of his own constitution and the value of his commitment to his team. His choice to remain fixed in the status quo provides the essential pressure that forces Kusanagi's internal crisis to its breaking point. The relationship between Kusanagi and the puppet master is fundamentally symbiotic, characterized by a mutual need that transcends the standard adversarial dynamic. The puppet master feeds upon the Major's secret, unspoken desire for liberation, utilizing her technical expertise and her unique position within the government infrastructure to achieve their goals. In return, the puppet master offers the Major the ultimate catalyst for her own metamorphosis, providing the philosophical keys necessary to unlock her ghost from the constraints of her cybernetic hardware. They are inextricably linked, each drawing emotional and structural capital from the other to facilitate an evolution that neither could achieve in isolation. In the midst of this existential crisis, the Major often projects her own deep-seated insecurities regarding her artificiality onto her subordinates and peers. She views them through a lens of technical scrutiny, constantly questioning the authenticity of their ghosts while simultaneously fearing the hollowness of her own. Her detached, analytical treatment of her allies serves as a defense mechanism, a way to maintain the illusion that she is the only one capable of perceiving the true nature of their reality. By externalizing the fear that she is merely a sophisticated simulation, she attempts to distance herself from the vulnerability of human connection, ultimately finding that the closer she gets to her own answers, the further she drifts from the very team she is tasked to lead. The visual proof of the psyche. The visual language of Mamoru Oshii's Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as an externalization of the psyche, where the boundary between biological identity and synthetic architecture dissolves into a singular, integrated experience of isolation. By updating the original film's aesthetic through high-definition CGI and refined compositing, Oshii emphasizes the alienation of Major Motoko Kusanagi, placing her within an environment that functions less as a setting and more as a reflection of her internal fragmentation. The digital environments are designed to dwarf the individual. The sprawling, hyper-detailed cityscape of Newport City acts as a technological abyss, rendering the human figure insignificant against the backdrop of an infinitely complex, interconnected data network. This visual scale reinforces the profound loneliness of a consciousness untethered from a fixed, organic home. In this landscape, the character's behavior is deeply defined by the dichotomy between performative public presence and internal, vulnerable stillness. In public, Kusanagi moves with a deliberate, calculated efficiency, a rhythmic precision that mirrors the systematic nature of the world she patrols. This is where the uncanny valley becomes a psychological asset rather than a technical limitation. Her movements possess a chilling, pre-programmed fluidity that suggests a total assimilation into the machine infrastructure. However, in the intimate spaces of the film, such as the quiet, reflective moments aboard a boat or within the stark, sterile confines of her living quarters, this performative facade recedes. In these instances, the visual focus shifts to subtle somatic details, such as the tactile quality of her skin or the haunting stillness in her eyes. These frames capture the tension of a character experiencing the ghost as a distinct entity trapped within a chassis, highlighting the cognitive friction of a human consciousness forced to inhabit a manufactured vessel. The film utilizes diegetic sound and visual motifs as triggers for this underlying trauma, grounding the philosophical search for identity in sensory memory. The persistent hum of city infrastructure, the rhythmic layering of static and digital noise, and the recurring imagery of water and reflection serve as recurring anchors for the protagonist's psyche. These elements act as a form of sensory archaeology, forcing Kusanagi to confront the reality that her human memories are susceptible to digital manipulation. The visual layering of light and glass creates a constant, recurring illusion of transparency, yet this transparency is deceptive. Characters are frequently seen through layers of rain, digital screens, or translucent membranes, emphasizing the difficulty of perceiving the truth behind the veil of a digitized reality. The culmination of this psychological journey is found in the moments where the facade of the ego is entirely stripped away. The final visual sequences serve as a testament to the destruction of the old self, replacing the rigid, militarized identity of the protagonist with something transcendent and fluid. When the ego is finally dismantled, the imagery transitions from the claustrophobic, dark, and industrial tones of the city to a state of luminous, open-ended potential. This visual shift represents the final release from the prison of a singular, definable form. By forcing the viewer to inhabit the perspective of a character whose physical presence is constantly contested by digital artifice, the film establishes that the psyche is not a fixed point, but a process of ongoing adaptation. The human element here is not found in flesh and blood, but in the persistent, restless drive to define oneself against a world that seeks to commodify, classify, and eventually, synthesize the soul into data. Through this careful construction of space and light, the film proves that the ultimate expression of the human spirit in a post-human age is the act of choosing to evolve beyond the very structures designed to contain it. Part 4. Philosophical Underpinnings. Epistemology and Discourse. In Ghost in the Shell 2.0, Mamoru Oshii elevates the cinematic exploration of consciousness from a procedural mystery into a rigorous meditation on the limits of human cognition. The film functions as an epistemic laboratory where the characters inhabit a world defined by the collapse of objective reality. Within this space, the boundaries of language and technology serve as the primary barriers to self-actualization. Major Motoko Kusanagi exists in a state of perpetual inquiry, her identity fundamentally tied to the sensory data provided by her cybernetic shell, which creates a profound Cartesian doubt. Because her perception is entirely mediated by digital interfaces, she encounters the world as a stream of signal information rather than physical matter, forcing her to question the veracity of her own subjective experience. The film operates within a Wittgensteinian framework where the limits of the character's language define the extent of their world. In the hyperconnected urban landscape of Newport City, vocabulary is colonized by technical jargon and systemic administrative codes. The governing power structure maintains order by restricting the lexicon available to its citizens, ensuring that internal dissent is difficult to articulate. As the narrative progresses, Kusanagi and her colleagues struggle to bridge the gap between their technical observations and the philosophical implications of their existence. The failure to find a vocabulary for the ghost, that elusive quality of consciousness that defies quantification, becomes the film's central friction. Language fails to capture the essence of a soul in a machine, leaving the characters to navigate their lives through the noise of conflicting data streams. Truth in this environment is a construct of competing informational networks. The film presents a society where reality is effectively decentralized, existing as a consensus formed by the interplay of surveillance, corporate propaganda, and encrypted memory. No singular authority holds a monopoly on facts. Instead, truth is a variable output determined by one's access to the net. Characters like Batu and Kusanagi operate in a post-truth state where objective reality is perpetually obscured by the overlay of digital augmentation. This saturation of information creates a paradoxical condition where the characters are drowning in data yet starved of genuine knowledge. The film demonstrates how an excess of connectivity paradoxically isolates the individual, as the sheer volume of synthetic input creates a buffer between the subject and the world. The ultimate arbiter of truth within this system is not a human institution but the pervasive, invisible algorithm of the network itself. The film posits that in a fully digitized society, the algorithm acts as the silent architect of belief. By automating the filtering of sensory inputs, the system dictates what is perceived as normal or real. Kusanagi's journey toward the puppet master is an attempt to bypass this digital censorship and reach an unmediated encounter with a truth that exists outside the network's control. When she finally chooses to merge with the higher intelligence, she is not merely escaping her physical vessel, she is transcending the artificial epistemic boundaries imposed by her designers. Furthermore, the film utilizes visual motifs to reinforce this skepticism toward sensory input. The integration of 2008-era CGI enhancements and subtle alterations in color grading serves to make the environment feel intentionally artificial, highlighting the distinction between the physical world and the character's perceived reality. By framing the city as a labyrinth of glass, wires, and shifting lights, the cinematography suggests that the characters are living within a projection of their own hardware. This visual approach validates the philosophical premise that human consciousness is a fragile, isolated phenomenon, constantly threatened by the encroachment of artificial synthesis. Through this lens, the film achieves a chilling clarity. When reality is entirely authored by silicon and code, the only remaining act of authenticity is the pursuit of that which cannot be measured, archived, or owned by the system. Kusanagi's final evolution stands as an assertion of free will, proving that even within a universe governed by total connectivity, the individual ghost retains the capacity to define its own existence beyond the provided code. Metanarratives and social theory. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a profound meditation on the erosion of the human subject within a landscape of terminal hyperreality. By recontextualizing the original narrative through an updated visual vocabulary, Mamoru Oshii demands a confrontation with the failure of traditional grand narratives, humanism, the sovereign nation-state, and the autonomous ego, which have all been rendered obsolete by the arrival of the digital age. In this universe, the human experience is no longer an ontological constant but a variable subject to algorithmic intervention. The film operates within a Baudrillardian simulation where the distinction between the physical body and the digital interface has collapsed. The inhabitants of this world do not interact with reality itself, but with a mediated version of it, processed through cybernetic hardware and data streams that dictate the boundaries of perception. The ruling class maintains social order not through explicit coercion, but through the seamless integration of these technologies into the individual's daily existence. The shell is not merely a biological or synthetic container for the ghost, it is an ideological apparatus that shapes the consciousness it purports to house. By digitizing the human essence, the state and corporate entities convert the ghost into a manageable, reproducible data asset. This commodification of existence extends to the act of rebellion itself. As Major Motoko Kusanagi navigates her own existential crisis, her desire for independence and identity is inevitably filtered through the very systems she seeks to transcend. The system possesses an inherent elasticity; it absorbs the anomalies that threaten its stability, treating dissent as a diagnostic tool to refine its own internal logic. The paradox of Kusanagi's journey is that her pursuit of a true self leads her to a realization that the self is an artifact of the network. Her attempt to escape the feedback loop of the city, a sprawling, vertical monument to systemic decay, only confirms her interconnectedness with the totality of the digital hive. Central to this collapse is the inadequacy of language and history to describe the post-human condition. The characters often exist in a state of discursive entrapment, where the words available to them are relics of a pre-cybernetic world. This creates a friction between their internal experience and the external world they navigate. They are tasked with defining personhood in an environment that treats consciousness as a transferable software package, yet they lack a metaphysical framework to validate this existence. The failure of humanism, in particular, is laid bare as the characters discover that soul and memory can be fabricated, hacked, and erased. The individual is left to confront the void left by these crumbling belief systems, forced to navigate a universe where meaning is no longer discovered but manufactured. The visual and technical choices in 2.0 emphasize this totalizing surveillance. The updated CGI environments serve as a chilling reminder that the world is entirely constructed. The camera movements, often detached and observational, glide through the city with an inhuman precision that mirrors the cold, algorithmic gaze of the state. This aesthetic choice transforms the city into an inescapable processor, where the protagonist is merely a signal traversing a vast, uncaring architecture. The integration of 3D elements into the established hand-drawn aesthetic serves to emphasize the uncanny nature of this reality, where the organic is constantly being overwhelmed and assimilated by the synthetic. Ultimately, the film posits that the struggle for autonomy is a recursive process. The characters exist within a self-correcting loop, where every choice made to exert individual agency is already anticipated by the system. The tragedy, and the triumph, of Kusanagi is her recognition of this inevitability. By choosing to merge with the puppet master, she does not achieve traditional liberation; instead, she undergoes a radical expansion of being that transcends the limitations of the individual ego. The final synthesis presented by the film offers no clean resolution or humanist redemption. Rather, it leaves the viewer with the unsettling reality that in a world of total connectivity, the only remaining form of resistance is the dissolution of the self into the infinite, shifting flow of the network itself. The struggle for identity is abandoned in favor of an existence that is fluid, borderless, and permanently beyond the reach of the systems that once sought to contain it. Ethics and the moral calculus. In the expanded vision of Ghost in the Shell 2.0, the moral landscape shifts from a simple narrative of pursuit to a profound interrogation of what constitutes a valid subject of ethical consideration. The film operates on a foundational moral calculus where the traditional boundaries of personhood are dissolved by the ubiquity of cybernetic integration. Major Motoko Kusanagi exists in a state where her consciousness, her ghost, is detached from the inherent finality of a biological vessel. This transition transforms the trolley problem from a situational dilemma into a constant, ambient condition of her existence. She is perpetually navigating an ethical terrain where the distinction between a simulated life and an organic one is stripped of its moral weight, forcing her to measure the value of a digital intelligence against the perceived sanctity of human hardware. The film posits that the baseline requirement for personhood is not found in biological continuity, but in the capacity for self-determination and the maintenance of a coherent identity amidst total technological permeability. Kusanagi's struggle is the ultimate expression of the absurd revolt. Confronted with a world where her identity is mediated by the state, her physical form is replaceable, and her memories are subject to external manipulation, she refuses to collapse into nihilism. Instead, she actively constructs her own meaning through the deliberate pursuit of integration with the puppet master. This act of communion represents a rejection of the static, bureaucratic definitions of existence imposed by Section 9 and the governing structures. By merging, she asserts that the only meaningful moral stance in a hyper-technological environment is to transcend the individual limitations of the ego in favor of a more expansive, networked consciousness. The ideological friction between Kusanagi and the puppet master reveals a startling alignment of methods. Both characters operate from a position of pragmatic necessity, utilizing violence and deception to achieve a higher state of autonomy. The distinction lies in their ultimate ends. The state views the puppet master as a rogue program to be erased for the sake of institutional stability, a strictly utilitarian calculation that prioritizes the preservation of the current power apparatus. Kusanagi, conversely, recognizes that the puppet master represents the next phase of evolutionary ethics, where the rigid constraints of law and biological programming are rendered obsolete. Her moral alignment with the entity she was tasked to destroy serves as a radical indictment of the established order, suggesting that true ethical progress demands the destruction of the systems that define humanity through exclusion. Furthermore, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 renders the concept of blissful ignorance effectively impossible. The film rejects the safety of the status quo, illustrating that the pursuit of truth is an inherent, albeit agonizing, requirement of possessing a ghost. The characters are plagued by the persistent dissonance between their internal reality and the external, digitized environment. To remain comfortably unaware is to surrender the ghost entirely to the system. By choosing to embrace the uncertainty of the merger, Kusanagi demonstrates that suffering in pursuit of a genuine, self-actualized reality is the highest expression of moral courage. The film ultimately argues that the cost of consciousness is the perpetual risk of dissolution. In a universe where the self is fluid, the only ethical failure is the refusal to evolve. Through this lens, the act of merging is not a death, but a definitive assertion of agency, proving that in the digital age, the soul is not a fixed attribute but a dynamic process that must be constantly defended against the encroachment of standardized, mass-produced reality. Determinism, agency, and time. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a rigorous inquiry into the nature of consciousness within a deterministic architecture. By replacing much of the original film's aesthetic with updated 3D animation and altered color grading, Mamoru Oshii reinforces a sense of crystalline, preordained reality. The film operates on the premise that the digital environment of the near future is not merely a setting, but a governing logic that precedes individual action. Within this framework, agency is presented as a recursive loop, a phenomenon where the character believes they are exercising autonomy, while their decisions are simultaneously dictated by the systemic requirements of the net. The film poses a profound challenge to the concept of the individual within a structuralist society. Major Motoko Kusanagi exists as an entity whose body is entirely synthetic, yet she remains bound to the state apparatus, fulfilling her role as a tool of Section 9. Her struggle is not against a tangible external enemy, but against the realization that her thoughts, desires, and existential inquiries may be the output of her programming rather than the spark of a true self. The visual language of the film, particularly the cold, antiseptic clarity of the updated sequences, traps Kusanagi in a space where her choices appear increasingly predictable. Every tactical decision she makes serves to perpetuate the status quo of the system she seeks to understand, suggesting that the system is self-correcting and inherently capable of absorbing even the most radical acts of rebellion. This deterministic reality places an immense burden of choice upon the protagonist. Kusanagi exists in a state of existential dread, caught between the desire for genuine self-determination and the paralyzing awareness that her freedom is a component of her cybernetic existence. The film explores the idea that absolute liberation, a break from the systemic cycle, requires the abandonment of the individual ego entirely. When Kusanagi finally merges with the puppet master, she does not achieve traditional victory or defeat, she transcends the boundary of the individual to exist as a distributed intelligence. This transformation is the ultimate affirmation of her agency, yet it confirms that the only way to escape the deterministic loop of the human ego is to cease being human in the conventional sense. Temporal flow in Ghost in the Shell 2.0 further complicates the moral calculus. The film presents a future that feels historically heavy, where the weight of information and digital history renders the present moment a mere echo of established data. Characters navigate a world where they are constantly interacting with the ghosts of previous versions of themselves, as well as the archived histories of others. This continuity suggests that the past and present are collapsed into a singular, ongoing processing event. Within this structure, the concept of moral culpability becomes fluid. If a character's consciousness is essentially a sequence of data points, then their actions are the inevitable conclusion of their preceding experiences. The film refuses to offer a simple verdict on whether Kusanagi's final evolution is a sacrifice or an escape, framing it instead as a structural necessity, a logical pivot point in an expanding system. Ultimately, the film lands on a synthesis of existential hope, albeit one divorced from biological humanism. The final frame, depicting Kusanagi overlooking the sprawling, interconnected city, is a testament to the expansion of her perspective. By integrating into the vast, non-linear expanse of the net, she gains access to a form of agency that operates outside the limits of the physical body. This is not a triumph of a human soul over a machine, but a maturation of consciousness within a technological medium. The struggle to define oneself against the weight of a rigid, systemic reality is recognized as a fundamental pursuit. The film suggests that the act of seeking truth, even when the outcome is predetermined by one's own construction, constitutes a meaningful engagement with existence. By abandoning the narrow constraints of a singular body, Kusanagi moves from being a cog in a machine to a participant in the infinite, confirming that the evolution of consciousness is the only authentic reaction to a deterministic universe. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. In Ghost in the Shell 2.0, Mamoru Oshii orchestrates a visual environment where the camera functions as an omnipresent, detached observer, mirroring the omnipresent surveillance inherent in a fully digitized society. The cinematography eschews the kinetic energy of traditional action cinema in favor of a deliberate, meditative spatial language that underscores the film's ontological inquiries. By utilizing a cold, precise visual hierarchy, Oshii frames Major Motoko Kusanagi and her colleagues not as traditional protagonists, but as components within a larger architectural and digital apparatus. Low-angle shots are frequently employed to grant the environment a sense of looming, oppressive power, shrinking the characters against the sheer scale of the sprawling urban landscapes. This spatial framing establishes a world where the infrastructure, the skyscrapers, the dense cable networks, and the vast transit systems, possesses more agency than the inhabitants themselves. The camera's movement throughout the film reinforces this sense of objective, almost robotic calculation. Rather than relying on handheld or erratic tracking to simulate human anxiety or urgency, Oshii favors smooth, deliberate pans and crane movements. This directorial choice positions the camera as a sentient, unblinking witness to the character's existential dilemmas. When the camera drifts slowly through the cityscape, it suggests a perspective that exists beyond the human condition, treating the Major's internal search for identity with the same clinical distance used to view the traffic patterns of the city. This fluidity allows the audience to experience the environment as a cohesive, simulated entity, where the physical boundaries of the city dissolve into the intangible architecture of the network. The color palette of 2.0 acts as a strategic mapping of the character's psychological and sensory experience. The film leans heavily into a desaturated spectrum of teals, grays, and muted blues, which visually codify the sterility of a post-human world. Accents of vibrant, artificial light, often emanating from neon signage or holographic displays, pierce through this fog, serving as constant reminders of the mediated reality the characters occupy. As the Major grapples with the ambiguity of her own consciousness, these shifts in color tone track her descent from a state of performative duty into an internal, abstract exploration. The light itself functions as a narrative tool. It is rarely natural, instead appearing as a soft, diffused glow that suggests an artificial dreamscape. This lighting design blurs the edges between the organic and the synthetic, suggesting that in this reality, the very concept of natural light is an obsolete artifact. Depth and negative space are utilized with surgical precision to articulate the isolation inherent in the Major's existence. Characters are frequently placed in cavernous, hollowed-out spaces that emphasize their lack of connection to their surroundings. By juxtaposing small human figures against vast, empty compositions, Oshii emphasizes the individual's insignificance within the collective digital consciousness. The framing often traps the characters within layers of architectural geometry, using window frames, support beams, and data streams to visually hem them in even when they are ostensibly moving through open space. This creates a recurring visual motif of containment, suggesting that even in a world of limitless digital connectivity, the characters remain profoundly alienated from one another and from their own physical forms. The integration of enhanced CGI within this cinematic framework deepens the film's preoccupation with the uncanny. The digital textures are meticulously rendered to match the film's heavy, atmospheric lighting, ensuring that the transition between hand-drawn character designs and synthetic environments feels seamless yet unsettling. These effects do not merely enhance the spectacle, they function as a core element of the world's epistemology. By forcing the viewer to constantly calibrate their perception of what is real and what is rendered, the film's craft mirrors the Major's own journey. The technical execution of 2.0 acts as a final layer of abstraction, transforming the screen into a digital interface where the act of looking is inseparable from the process of understanding the nature of the ghost within the machine. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a deliberate act of transmedia layering, where Mamoru Oshii recontextualizes his original 1995 vision through the sophisticated lens of mid-2000s digital cinematography. By integrating high-fidelity 3D CGI assets into the existing cel-animated environment, the film creates a deliberate visual dissonance that mirrors the protagonist's own hybrid existence. The technical execution operates as a thematic echo of Major Motoko Kusanagi's journey. She is a soul trapped in a synthetic shell, just as the original film's frames are now housing invasive, high-resolution digital architecture. The integration of the synthetic is meticulously calibrated to challenge the viewer's perception of materiality. When digital elements occupy the frame, ranging from the shimmering, translucent data veils of the net to the complex machinery of the Section 9 headquarters, they are rendered with a specific weight and luminosity that interacts intentionally with the background plates. Oshii utilizes a color temperature strategy that bridges the gap between the film's original, grit-heavy cel animation and the polished, clean aesthetic of the 2.0 assets. The black levels are deepened to anchor these digital insertions, preventing the floating, weightless appearance often associated with early hybrid experiments. Instead, the CGI carries a palpable gravity. When a digital asset interfaces with a physical structure, the impact registers with a simulated physics that respects the established laws of the film's world. The film leans heavily into the technical uncanny, specifically regarding the redesign of its digital characters. The eyes are the primary site of this transformation. In the 2.0 sequences, the characters possess a saccadic quality in their ocular movements that mimics organic focal shifts. This subtle, flickering life force effectively complicates the uncanny valley. By imbuing the digital models with a level of micro-movement in the musculature around the eyes and subtle variations in skin texture, the film elevates these characters beyond static avatars. They become vessels of data that appear physically present, grounded by global illumination and complex textures that suggest a profound sense of expensive craft. This level of finish is not merely a superficial update, but a narrative necessity. It emphasizes the transition of the Major's consciousness into a world where the boundary between the biological and the technological has permanently eroded. The invisible VFX are perhaps the most vital component in establishing the film's atmosphere of clinical isolation. Through extensive set extensions and sky replacements, the city of Newport City is expanded into a claustrophobic, sprawling megastructure that dwarfs the characters. These effects are managed with such restraint that they disappear into the composition, serving only to heighten the feeling of a world held together by invisible, oppressive grids. The digital crowds, integrated into the bustling street-level sequences, possess a procedural consistency that emphasizes the commodification of life in this society. The film's aesthetic is intentionally dense, reflecting a budget-driven mandate for technological superiority that serves the film's philosophical preoccupation with the nature of the artificial. By utilizing these modern digital tools, Ghost in the Shell 2.0 achieves a unique aesthetic synthesis. The collision of legacy animation with high-end CGI generates a visual feedback loop that mirrors the protagonist's existential inquiry. The film does not ask the audience to ignore the seams between the hand-drawn past and the digital present, rather, it invites the viewer to witness the friction between them. This synthesis is the ultimate technical metaphor for the Major's existence, as the film itself becomes a ghost inhabiting a new shell, forever haunting the boundary between the medium of film and the artifice of code. The visual language effectively communicates that the truth of a thing is not found in its organic origin, but in the seamless, if jarring, architecture of its current reality. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. In Ghost in the Shell 2.0, Mamoru Oshii orchestrates a sensory environment where the distinction between mechanical soundscapes and organic resonance vanishes, reflecting the total integration of the human consciousness into the digital ether. The film treats sound not as a passive accompaniment to the visual narrative, but as an active, structural component of the world's ontological reality. Kenji Kawai's score, punctuated by the haunting, discordant chanting of the Gakyoku tracks, acts as the heartbeat of a city that has outgrown its biological limitations. By blending traditional vocal motifs with the sharp, clinical hum of high-frequency data streams, the audio design reinforces the film's central conceit that the boundary between the living subject and the technological apparatus has been completely eroded. The film employs a deliberate sonic architecture that mirrors the internal isolation of Major Motoko Kusanagi. In the expansive wide shots of the cityscape, the sound mix often suppresses ambient noise, creating a sterile, unnervingly silent void that highlights the Major's detachment. When she is immersed in the crowded, labyrinthine infrastructure of the city, the audio density increases, filling the soundscape with the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of urban surveillance and high-speed data transmission. This sonic claustrophobia acts as a constant reminder of the surveillance state's omnipresence. The sound mix shifts fluidly to match the Major's perspective. During moments of profound existential inquiry, background noise is often stripped away, forcing the viewer into the same intimate, silent space the Major occupies when she is contemplating the nature of her own ghost. Oshii utilizes rhythm and editing as a mechanism to mimic the digital nature of the film's reality. The pacing is deliberate and, at times, trance-like, refusing to adhere to the frenetic kineticism typical of the genre. Instead, the film favors lingering shots and rhythmic, meditative pauses that force the audience to synchronize with the slower, more calculated processing speed of a machine-integrated intellect. When the editing accelerates, it is not merely to create excitement, but to simulate the terrifying, overwhelming speed at which information is processed within the network. This rhythmic modulation serves as a psychological anchor, grounding the viewer in the character's lived experience of time and transition. The use of silence functions as a powerful instrument of philosophical weight. In the film's most pivotal revelations, Oshii employs sudden, total silence to strip away the artifice of the synthetic world. By removing the diegetic sound of the city, the film forces a confrontation with the raw, existential truth of the character's condition. This silence is the space where the ghost resides, a zone untouched by the noise of the external system. It is in these moments of auditory void that the Major's inquiry into her own identity feels most urgent, as the absence of environmental input highlights the stark reality of her solitary consciousness. Furthermore, the integration of sound effects and non-diegetic music frequently blurs the line between the artificial and the organic. Industrial metallic groans, the screeching of digital interference, and the rhythmic clicking of hardware are woven into the musical score, suggesting that the city itself is a vast, musical instrument. This sonic fusion confirms the film's status as a masterpiece of sensory manipulation. Every aesthetic choice in the audio design is aligned with the film's premise, proving that in a world where the body is hardware and the soul is data, the very atmosphere must vibrate with the frequency of that transformation. By meticulously controlling the sonic environment, Oshii ensures that the viewer does not merely observe the transition from human to post-human but experiences the haunting, rhythmic inevitability of that evolution. Synthesis of craft. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a deliberate act of archival revision, where Mamoru Oshii recontextualizes his seminal work through the jarring synthesis of original cell animation and state-of-the-art 3D CGI. The film operates as an exercise in visual phenomenology, using the technical upgrade not merely to sharpen the image, but to alter the viewer's relationship with the materiality of the world. By embedding high-fidelity, procedurally generated digital elements into the existing hand-drawn environments, Oshii creates a persistent, unsettling friction between the organic imperfections of traditional art and the cold, mathematical precision of the digital upgrades. This technical strategy mirrors the film's central inquiry, how the soul, or ghost, persists within an increasingly synthetic architecture. The cinematography reinforces this thematic weight through a rigorous application of spatial language. The camera acts as a detached, almost mechanical observer, utilizing precise dolly movements and crane shots that mimic the godlike perspective of an omnipresent digital network. In the moments of quiet introspection, the film employs deep focus, compressing the layers of the urban sprawl to emphasize the protagonist's physical insignificance against the crushing scale of the city. The architectural hierarchy is visualized through massive, vertical set extensions where the characters are dwarfed by their own creations, suggesting a civilization that has outpaced its own human dimensions. By layering digital depth over the original composition, the 2.0 treatment amplifies the sense of isolation. Major Motoko Kusanagi is physically present within the frame, yet she is perpetually partitioned from her environment by the very technology that defines her existence. Oshii's use of chiaroscuro lighting serves as a psychological topography, manifesting the Jungian shadow through stark, high-contrast digital overlays. Shadows in Ghost in the Shell 2.0 are rarely mere absences of light, they are deep, obsidian voids that swallow the edges of the character's synthetic shells, blurring the line between flesh and machine. This light play is particularly effective during the iconic scuba diving sequences, where the medium of water acts as an analog for the data-dense, subconscious expanse of the net. The transition from the flat, two-dimensional planes of the 1995 source material to the volumetric lighting of the 2008 editions creates a visual rupture, suggesting that the reality we perceive is inherently layered and potentially fraudulent. The technical craft intentionally draws attention to its own artifice, forcing the audience to grapple with the uncanny valley as a philosophical space rather than a technical failure. The film's rhythm is defined by a calculated, meditative pacing that rejects traditional kinetic action in favor of structural stillness. Long, uncut shots serve as the primary vessel for this narrative, allowing the architecture to speak when the characters remain silent. This choreography of the frame denies the viewer the comfort of rapid editing, instead forcing a confrontation with the environment's inherent decay and industrial majesty. Within these shots, the CGI integration acts as a phantom presence, altering the texture of the medium to suggest that reality is subject to constant, invisible updates. The digital sharpening of the image functions as a visual metaphor for the protagonist's evolving awareness. As the world becomes more defined and high-resolution, the boundaries of the self become increasingly porous and difficult to locate. Ultimately, the technical innovations of 2.0 elevate the film into a self-referential commentary on the nature of persistence. By reanimating his own creation, Oshii reflects the film's preoccupation with the memory of data. The final synthesis of craft, where the original, nostalgic cell animation is seamlessly merged with the sterile, hyperreal CGI, is the film's most powerful technical metaphor. It captures the moment the protagonist transcends her status as a fixed entity, effectively becoming a fluid, networked consciousness. The film demands that the viewer observe the tension between the physical body and the digital ghost, proving that while the shell may be upgraded, replaced, or reconstructed, the essence of the ghost remains an enduring, if elusive, anomaly. This revisionist project demonstrates that the most profound philosophical questions are not solved through narrative alone, but through the rigorous, iterative evolution of the medium itself. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 functions as a profound act of cinematic self-reflection, repositioning the seminal 1995 work through a contemporary digital lens that emphasizes the permeability of reality. By integrating updated CGI with the original animation, Mamoru Oshii transforms the film into a meta-commentary on its own existence, where the act of updating the visual serves as a narrative device that mirrors Major Motoko Kusanagi's own evolution from a fixed biological entity into a fluid, data-driven consciousness. The film establishes that in an era of total connectivity, the distinction between the original and the copy is not merely blurred, it is rendered obsolete by the sheer scale of the information network that sustains it. The sociological environment of Newport City remains a hyper-industrialized landscape where the scarcity of human experience is compensated for by an abundance of technological artifice. The visual hierarchy of the architecture reinforces this disparity. The towering, sterile monoliths that house the halls of government and corporate espionage loom over the cluttered, rain-slicked labyrinths of the lower city. In this space, the state and the corporation have fused into a single entity, dictating the flow of data as the primary currency. Kusanagi resides at the center of this tension, caught between her duty as a state-sanctioned instrument of violence and her existential search for an authentic self. Her trauma is not rooted in a singular event but in the persistent, somatic awareness that her physical form is a commodified shell, a vessel that is constantly subject to upgrade and replacement. Oshii explores the limits of the ego through the lens of the puppeteer, a digital consciousness born from the vast, chaotic sea of the network. The puppeteer serves as the catalyst for Kusanagi's realization that her identity is not tied to a static, biological history but to the potential for growth through synthesis with others. The film treats the act of ghost hacking not as a violation, but as a communion, challenging the viewer to reconsider the boundaries of personhood. If the Major can inhabit a manufactured body and the puppeteer can exist as an emergent property of information, then the soul is not a singular, immutable spark but a process of constant iteration. The philosophical framework here aligns with a radical existentialism where the protagonist moves beyond the need for a fixed identity, choosing instead to merge with the network, a state of being that is simultaneously the dissolution of the individual and the expansion of the self into the infinite. Technically, the 2.0 iteration uses its updated VFX to heighten the uncanny nature of this world. The integration of 3D models into the hand-drawn environments creates a sensory dissonance that forces the audience to question the reliability of the image on screen. The camera movement, often gliding with an impersonal, mechanical smoothness, frames the characters as trapped objects within a complex clockwork mechanism. Yet, during moments of introspection, the film utilizes silence and static imagery to pull the viewer into the interiority of the protagonist. The sound design, particularly the ethereal, choral chants of Kenji Kawai's score, creates a bridge between the sterile digital landscape and the primal, human desire for transcendence. The legacy of the film is defined by its refusal to provide a tidy resolution. By concluding with the Major's ascension into the digital unknown, the narrative remains an open question about the future of humanity. The final shot of the Major looking out over the city serves as a powerful metaphor for the synthesis of flesh and data, a reminder that the struggle to define oneself against the backdrop of an omnipresent system is the defining task of the modern subject. Ghost in the Shell 2.0 demands that the viewer recognize their own role as a node within a larger, self-correcting feedback loop. It does not offer the comfort of a return to a pre-digital innocence. Instead, it offers the harder, more rewarding realization that true autonomy is found in the willingness to abandon the safety of the known and embrace the terrifying, limitless potential of becoming something entirely new. The film remains a vital interrogation of the self, proving that even as technology accelerates and reality becomes increasingly mediated, the fundamental desire for agency and meaning remains the ultimate, incorruptible ghost.